The morning of December 6, 1944, brought no comfort to the men of the 104th Infantry Division's 413th Regiment. In the bombed remains of Lucherberg, Germany, a village whose name few Americans could pronounce and fewer would remember, Private First Class George Burns crouched behind the skeletal frame of what had been someone's home. The war had reduced it to rubble and frozen mud. 22 years old, raised on a farm in Illinois, Burns had joined the army believing he understood hardship. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He had worked land that refused to yield. He had seen livestock die in bitter winters. He thought he knew what it meant to face something larger than himself. He was wrong. Outside in the village square, the sound that would define his war rumbled closer. Not the familiar clatter of American Shermans, not the grinding complaint of halftracks on frozen roads. This was different. Heavier, a mechanical thunder that shook the ground and rattled what remained of the walls. Burns knew the sound now. Every man in Europe knew it. A Tiger tank was coming to kill him. The German Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger was not simply a tank, it was a mobile fortress weighing nearly 60 tons, armoured with steel plate up to 4 inches thick, mounting an 88mm gun that could punch through a Sherman at 2,000 yards. When American soldiers first encountered Tigers in Tunisia, the psychological impact exceeded even the tactical advantage. Here was a machine that rendered obsolete every assumption about armoured warfare. American tank doctrine emphasized mobility and numbers. German doctrine, increasingly desperate as the war turned, emphasized the Tiger. A weapon so powerful that a single example could dominate an entire battlefield. The mathematics were brutal. In direct combat, it took an average of 5 Sherman tanks to destroy one Tiger. The first 4 Shermans usually died trying. Burns had no Sherman tanks. What he possessed instead was a weapon whose very existence would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. Unstrapped from the side of an American tank destroyer, whose crew had refused to help, Burns held in his hands a M1A1 Bazooka, officially designated the launcher, rocket, 2.36-inch, anti-tank, M-1. This 5-foot tube of welded steel represented one of the genuine revolutions in infantry armament. Before the bazooka, an individual soldier facing a tank had essentially 3 options: run, surrender, or trying to place a demolition charge. The bazooka changed that calculation. With its rocket-propelled shaped charge warhead, an infantryman could theoretically engage armor at ranges up to 300 yards. The shaped charge worked on a principle that seemed almost magical. Upon impact, the explosive force didn't spread outward. Instead, it focused inward, creating a jet of superheated metal capable of penetrating 3 inches of steel. Against the early German tanks American forces encountered in North Africa, the M1 Bazooka had proved reasonably effective. Against a Tiger, the mathematics became considerably less favorable. The Tiger's frontal armor measured 102 mm at its thickest points. The bazooka's penetration capability ranged between 82 and 101 mm under ideal conditions. Those ideal conditions rarely existed. The rocket had to strike at a 90-degree angle. The range needed to be close, preferably under 100 yards. The target area had to avoid the Tiger's most heavily armored sections. These requirements meant that engaging a Tiger with a bazooka required getting close enough to see the rivets on its hull, aiming with precision despite the weapon's crude sights, and scoring a hit on the tank's vulnerable spots while its machine guns and main cannon searched for you. Most men who attempted this died in the attempt. The U.S. Army issued bazookas to infantry, squads knowing they represented a defensive option of last resort against heavy armor. No training manual suggested they were optimal for stopping Tigers. No tactical doctrine recommended sending a single infantryman with a bazooka against a 60-ton tank in open combat. What happened in Lucherberg that December morning would not appear in any manual. It would appear in the citation for a Distinguished Service Cross. To understand why Burns found himself alone with a bazooka facing a Tiger tank, one must understand the broader context of December 1944 in Germany's Hürtgen Forest region. The 104th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Timberwolves, had entered combat in early September as part of the massive Allied push following the breakout from Normandy. Their baptism of fire came near the Dutch-Belgian border, and through the autumn they had ground forward through a landscape of destroyed villages, dense forests, and increasingly desperate German resistance. By December, they found themselves fighting in Germany itself, in towns whose populations had fled, where every building could hide a Panzerfaust team and every crossroads might see the appearance of German armour. The Timberwolves were good soldiers, most of them draftees, turned into infantrymen through training that emphasized aggression and initiative. They had learned that the German army of late 1944 was not the Wehrmacht of 1940. These were not the master-race soldiers of propaganda. Many were teenagers, or men pulled from rear area positions, fighting with equipment that arrived sporadically if at all. But the Germans still possessed weapons that could kill efficiently. They still defended their homeland with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant complete destruction. And occasionally, they still possessed tigers. The German situation in the Hürtgen Forest sector represented what military historians would later recognize as a doomed defense. Germany's industrial capacity to produce tigers had always been limited. The tiger required 300,000 man-hours to manufacture, compared to 10,000 for a Sherman. Each tiger consumed fuel at a rate that Germany's collapsing logistics network could barely support. The complex transmission and suspension systems broke down frequently, requiring specialized parts that were increasingly unavailable. Yet, in December 1944, tigers still appeared at critical points in the German line. Sometimes they came as part of armored counterattacks. Sometimes they arrived as individual vehicles supporting infantry operations. Their appearance always had disproportionate impact. American infantry learned to fear the sound of a tiger's engine, to recognize the distinctive roar of its Maybach HL-230 power plant. That sound meant machine gun fire from a weapon you probably couldn't destroy. Artillery strikes from a gun that could hit you long before you could effectively return fire, and the psychological weight of facing something that felt invincible. Burns heard that sound now in Lucherberg. The tiger was close, perhaps 100 yards away, moving through the ruined streets toward the village centre. He could not see it yet through the shattered buildings, but he could hear the squeal of its tracks on frozen ground, the diesel rumble of its engine. Somewhere nearby were other American soldiers, but Burns could not locate them in the chaos. The village had been under assault for hours. German infantry, supported by the Tiger, were attempting to drive the Americans out. Burns had been separated from his unit in the confusion of house-to-house fighting. He had found himself in what had been someone's living room, watching through a window frame as the Tiger approached. He had no illusions about the bazooka's limitations. He had seen the weapon fail against German armor before. He knew that a frontal shot against a Tiger would most likely result in the rocket bouncing off harmlessly or detonating without penetration, while the Tiger's gunner traversed his turret to return fire. But he also knew that the Tiger could not be allowed to continue its advance unchallenged. Men he knew, men from farms and cities who had trained beside him, would die if the Tiger reached them. So George Burns, farm boy from Illinois, made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not run, he would not hide. He would take the bazooka, move toward the Tiger, and find a way to stop it. This decision was not heroic in the sense that Hollywood would later portray heroism. It was practical, born from the understanding that someone had to act, and he happened to be the person present. It was also terrifying. Burns would later admit that fear dominated every thought as he moved through the ruins toward the tank. He checked the bazooka's mechanism, loaded a rocket, and began working his way forward through the destroyed buildings. The Tiger was perhaps 75 yards away now, its turret traversing slowly as it searched for targets. Through gaps in the rubble, Burns could see its massive form, winter whitewash over dark grey paint, exhaust smoke rising in the cold air. He needed to get closer. The bazooka's sights were rudimentary, A simple wireframe adjusted that morning using a bent kothanga because the originals had been lost. Accuracy beyond 100 yards was largely theoretical. Even at 50 yards, hitting a specific point on a moving target required luck as much as skill. Burns found his position in what remained of a stone house facing the square. The Tiger had stopped, its commander visible in the open hatch, surveying the area. This was Burns' moment. If the tank began moving again, or if the commander spotted him first, he would die before he could fire. He raised the bazooka to his shoulder, feeling its weight and the cold metal against his cheek. The crude sights aligned on the Tiger's side, where the armor was thinner, where a rocket might penetrate. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket motor ignited with a whoosh, the backblast filling the room with smoke and dust. The rocket streaked across the square, trailing white exhaust. It missed. The projectile passed over the Tiger's engine deck and exploded harmlessly against a building beyond. The Tiger's commander dropped into his hatch. The turret began to traverse toward Burns' position. Burns knew he had perhaps 20 seconds before the 88mm gun fired and turned his shelter into flying rubble. He grabbed another rocket, his hands shaking now, loaded it into the bazooka's tube. The loader who had volunteered to help him earlier had disappeared. Burns was alone. The Tiger's turret was still turning, the gun barrel swinging toward him with mechanical inevitability. He aimed again, no time for careful adjustment, just point and fire. The second rocket missed as well, striking the ground in front of the tank and creating a crater but inflicting no damage. Burns was about to die. He understood this with perfect clarity. The Tiger's main gun was trained on his position. German machine guns were probably doing the same. He could run, abandon the bazooka, try to escape through the buildings. Instead, something in Burns' character, some combination of stubbornness and desperation and the strange clarity that sometimes comes in moments of absolute crisis, made him load a third rocket. He stepped fully into the doorway of his shelter, exposing himself completely, and raised the bazooka. The Tiger was perhaps 50 feet away, close enough to see detail, close enough to see the German commander's face pale behind the vision blocks. Burns aimed not at the turret, not at the frontal armor where his rocket would certainly fail, but at the point where the Tiger's main gun connected to the turret housing. It was a target roughly 8 inches in diameter. At this range, with iron sights fabricated from wire, hitting such a specific point required luck that bordered on divine intervention. Burns fired. The rocket flew across the square in less than a second. It struck exactly where Burns aimed, penetrating the narrow gap between the gun mantlet and the turret face. The shaped charge detonated inside the turret. The Tiger did not explode in the dramatic fashion of Hollywood. Instead, its engine simply stopped. Smoke began pouring from the turret hatches. The crew bailed out, running from the disabled vehicle. Burns stared at what he had done, unable quite to process it. He had just accomplished something that armored warfare doctrine said should not be possible. He had destroyed a Tiger tank with a handheld anti-tank weapon, alone, at point-blank range, after missing twice. But the morning was not finished with George Burns, because in the chaos of Lucherberg that December day, one Tiger was not the only threat. A second Tiger had been advancing behind the first, and as the crew of the disabled tank ran for cover, this second Tiger rumbled into the square. Burns' third shot, the one that had disabled the first Tiger, had also attracted the attention of every German soldier in the vicinity. Small arms fire now raked his position. Machine gun rounds struck the stone walls around him. He was almost certainly about to die. He needed to reload. But the smoke and dust in his shelter made seeing difficult. His hands shook uncontrollably now, adrenaline and fear making fine motor control nearly impossible. He dropped a rocket, picked it up, loaded it backward, realized his mistake, corrected it. The second Tiger's turret was traversing. Its gun barrel, that terrible 88mm cannon, was seeking him. Time seemed to slow in that peculiar way it does when death becomes imminent. Burns could see every detail with preternatural clarity. The way smoke curled from the disabled, tiger's hatches, the frost on the ground where boots had not disturbed it. The face of a German soldier firing at him from across the square. He raised the bazooka one more time. He aimed at the second tiger, which was perhaps 60 feet away now, close enough that he could see the wear on its tracks, the scarring where small arms fire had scratched its paint. He aimed for the same weak point that had worked on the first tank, that narrow gap in the turret face. He fired. The rocket hit, not the precise spot he aimed for, but close enough. The shaped charge penetrated the tiger's turret armor at an angle, the jet of superheated metal burning through steel and into the crew compartment. This tiger did not stop cleanly like the first. Instead, something inside ignited. Ammunition, fuel, hydraulic fluid, all the volatile materials packed into a tank's interior. The tiger exploded. The blast wave threw Burns backward through the doorway. When he regained his senses, ears ringing, vision blurred, the second tiger was burning, orange flames and black smoke rising into the grey December sky. He had just destroyed 2 tiger tanks in the span of perhaps 90 seconds, with a weapon that theoretically should not be able to stop a tiger at all. At ranges so close that missing would have meant certain death. What George Burns accomplished in Lucherberg that morning violated every statistical probability. Later analysis would show that infantry bazooka teams rarely succeeded against tigers even under favourable conditions. The frontal armour was simply too thick, the weapon too inaccurate, the psychological pressure too great. Yet Burns had done what should not be possible, because he possessed 3 things that statistics could not account for: desperate courage, impossible luck, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from growing up on a farm where quit is not an option and every day brings problems that cannot be solved but must be solved anyway. When the German infantry assault collapsed following the loss of their tank support, Burns emerged from his shelter to find other American soldiers moving back into the village. They found him standing in the square, still holding the bazooka, staring at the burning wrecks. He was unable to explain clearly what had happened. His sergeant had to piece together the story from Burns' disjointed account and the physical evidence. 2 destroyed tigers, expended rocket casings, and 1 private first class who had somehow survived an encounter that should have killed him. The citation for Burns' Distinguished Service Cross would later describe his actions in formal military language, noting his extraordinary heroism and disregard for personal safety. It would mention the tactical significance of stopping the German attack. It would use phrases like above and beyond and in keeping with the highest traditions. What it could not adequately convey was the simple human reality of what Burns experienced: terror, desperate action, impossible success, and the weight of survival when others had not survived. Burns would carry that weight for the rest of his life, through post-war years in Florida, through decades of relative obscurity, until his death in 1994. He had been a farm boy who faced something larger than himself and found a way to stop it. Not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through individual action in a moment when action was required. The story of what happened in Lucherberg mattered not because it represented typical infantry combat, but because it represented combat's essential unpredictability. All the doctrine in the world, all the technical specifications and tactical manuals could not account for the human element. 1 man, 1 weapon, 1 impossible shot that worked when it should not have worked. December 1944 in Germany was filled with such moments. Small unit actions, individual heroism, tactical innovations, born from desperation. The broader war would be decided by industrial capacity, strategic bombing, the weight of armies. But on the ground, in villages whose names few remembered, the war was decided by men like George Burns, who found themselves in impossible situations, and somehow, against all probability, survived to see another day. 2 tigers destroyed by 1 man with a bazooka. The story sounds like propaganda, like the kind of tale embellished in retelling until truth becomes unrecognizable. but the after-action reports confirm it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Distinguished Service Cross validates it. The burned-out wrecks in Lucherberg's square testified to it. George Burns, farm boy from Illinois, stopped two of Germany's most powerful tanks with one of America's most basic anti-tank weapons. He did so not because he was a superhuman soldier, but because at a critical moment, when the alternative was watching other men die, he chose to act. That choice, and the impossible luck that allowed him to survive it, defined the difference between defeat and survival on a frozen December morning in a German village that history would otherwise forget. The bazooka that saved George Burns' life in Lucherberg existed because of a meeting that took place 2 years earlier, in May 1942, at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The weapon represented American military innovation at its most practical, born from desperation, developed rapidly, and fielded with minimal testing because the alternative was sending infantry against tanks with nothing but grenades and prayers. Understanding the bazooka's origins requires understanding the crisis that produced it. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the American military possessed no effective man-portable anti-tank weapon. The infantry anti-tank rifle, standard in European armies, fired armor-piercing bullets that could penetrate early tank armor, but required exceptional marksmanship and courage to use it effectively. The Americans had experimented with similar weapons, but found them inadequate. As German armor grew thicker through 1940 and 1941, even the anti-tank rifles became obsolete. What infantry needed was a weapon that could deliver explosive force against armor without requiring the soldier to approach within grenade-throwing distance. The solution came from an unlikely combination of World War I research and desperate innovation. Robert Goddard, better known for pioneering liquid-fuel rocketry, had developed a tube-launched rocket weapon in 1918. The armistice came before it could be tested in combat, and the project was abandoned. 2 decades later, with German tanks rolling across Europe, researchers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground remembered Goddard's work. Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Uhl were tasked with creating a delivery system for the M10-shaped charge grenade. The shaped charge itself was a British innovation, a warhead design that focused explosive force into a narrow jet capable of burning through steel armor. The problem was delivery. You couldn't throw a shaped charge far enough to be safe from the blast. Artillery shells worked but required calling in fire support that might not be available. What infantry needed was something portable, simple, and immediate. According to Uhl's later testimony, the breakthrough came by accident. Walking past a scrap pile at Aberdeen, he noticed a metal tube whose diameter happened to match the M10 grenade. The tube had been designed for entirely different purposes, but Uhl recognized its potential. If they could stabilize a rocket inside that tube, fire it from a soldier's shoulder, and keep the exhaust from burning the operator, they would have their weapon. Within weeks, working at frantic pace, Skinner and Uhl produced a prototype. On the morning of the demonstration at Aberdeen in May 1942, the weapon had no sights. Uhl fabricated them from a wire coat hanger bent with a broken nail. Despite this improvisation, or perhaps because the crude sights forced instinctive aiming, the weapon performed perfectly. It hit a moving tank multiple times while competing Spigot mortars. The technology everyone had assumed would dominate anti-tank warfare failed completely. Major General Gladion Barnes, Chief of Research and Engineering for Army Ordnance, watched the demonstration and reportedly said, "The launcher looked like Bob Burns's bazooka." Burns was a popular radio comedian whose signature prop was a crude musical instrument made from pipes and a funnel. The name stuck. Within months, the Army ordered 5,000 launchers. By the time American forces landed in North Africa in November 1942, bazookas were reaching frontline units. The weapon's combat debut revealed both its potential and its severe limitations. In Tunisia, during early 1943, American infantry first used bazookas against German armor in combat. The M1A1 variant, slightly improved from the original, could penetrate up to 3 inches of armor under ideal conditions. Against the Mark III and Mark IV panzers that formed the bulk of German armor in Africa, the bazooka proved adequate when crews could achieve hits on side or rear armor. Against Tigers, which first appeared in Tunisia, the mathematics became unfavorable. The Tiger's side armor measured 82 millimeters thick. The bazooka could theoretically penetrate that thickness, but only with a perfect 90-degree impact at close range. Real combat rarely provided perfect conditions. Despite these limitations, bazookas gave infantry a weapon they had lacked. Soldiers no longer felt completely helpless against armor. The psychological value exceeded the tactical effectiveness. A tank knew that infantry might be carrying bazookas. That knowledge made tank crews cautious, encouraged them to keep distance, reduced their effectiveness in close terrain. The mere existence of the bazooka changed armor tactics, even when the weapon failed to destroy tanks. The early bazooka suffered from serious technical problems. The electrical firing system, which used a dry cell battery to ignite the rocket motor, was unreliable in wet conditions. Humidity in the Pacific Theater caused frequent misfires. The rocket's propellant sometimes failed to ignite, leaving a live warhead stuck in the tube. The backblast, while not dangerous enough to require protective equipment, created a distinctive smoke signature that revealed the shooter's position. German and Japanese infantry learnt to watch for that signature and target bazooka teams immediately. The weapon's accuracy declined rapidly beyond 100 yards. Even skilled operators struggled to hit specific points on moving targets. Wind, temperature, even the age of the propellant affected trajectory. Operators learned through experience that the bazooka worked best at ranges under 50 yards, close enough that missing meant the target would almost certainly kill you before you could reload. By late 1943, the improved M9 bazooka reached combat units. The new model addressed some of the M1's deficiencies. A redesigned rocket, the M6A3, provided better penetration, up to 5 inches of armor under ideal conditions. The launcher itself was slightly longer, improving accuracy. The electrical firing system received weatherproofing that reduced misfire rates. But the fundamental limitations remained. The bazooka could not penetrate the frontal armor of late-war German tanks. The Tiger's frontal plate measured 102 millimeters thick and sloped, effectively increasing its resistance. The Panther, Germany's most numerous late-war tank, had sloped frontal armor 80 millimeters thick that the bazooka could not reliably defeat. Even the Tiger's side armor, theoretically within the bazooka's penetration range, required perfect shot placement. Real combat rarely allowed perfect shots. American infantry developed tactics to compensate for these limitations. Bazooka teams worked in pairs, one operator and one loader, though in desperate situations single soldiers used the weapon alone as Burns had done. Teams positioned themselves in locations that forced tanks to expose vulnerable side or rear armor, road junctions, narrow streets, anywhere terrain channeled armor into predictable paths. They waited until tanks were close, preferably within 50 feet, before firing. They aimed for specific weak points: the junction between turret and hull, the engine deck, the tracks themselves. Disabling a tank was as valuable as destroying it. A Tiger with broken tracks was a stationary pillbox, dangerous but no longer mobile. The doctrine emphasized ambush over direct engagement. Never fire at a tank that knew you were there. Never engage from open ground. Fire, displace immediately. Expect return fire, regardless of whether you hit or missed. These tactics worked when conditions allowed their implementation. Often they did not. Combat was chaos. Tanks appeared unexpectedly. Infantry found themselves in open ground with no cover. Desperation forced engagements at unfavorable ranges, against frontal armor, with degraded equipment. In such situations, The bazooka's effectiveness depended less on technology than on the courage and luck of the operator. Statistics compiled after the war showed that bazooka teams had a survival rate barely above 50% when engaging heavy armor. For every tiger stopped by a bazooka, another bazooka team died trying. The weapon was effective enough to be worth carrying, deadly enough to be worth fearing, but never reliable enough to be comforting. George Burns carried all this history with him into Lucherberg. He knew the bazooka's limitations because he had seen them demonstrated in earlier combat. He knew that engaging a tiger from the front was essentially suicide. He knew that his crude sights, his shaking hands, his fear, all conspired against accuracy. Yet he also knew something that no training manual could teach. Sometimes impossible is the only option available. The 2 tigers he destroyed represented perhaps the most unlikely bazooka success of the entire war. Most bazooka victories against tigers involved teams of soldiers, carefully positioned ambushes, multiple weapons firing simultaneously. Burns achieved it alone, in open combat, after missing his first 2 shots. The after-action report struggled to explain it. The citation mentioned courage and skill, but both Burns and his commanders knew that luck played the decisive role. An inch to either side and his 3rd shot would have bounced off armor. A second's delay and the tiger's gun would have fired first. A dozen small variables, any one of which could have resulted in his death, happened to align in his favor. In the weeks following Lucherberg, word of Burns' actions spread through the 104th Division. Soldiers requested transfers to his unit, believing his luck might be contagious. Officers studied the engagement, trying to determine what tactics could be extracted from it. The answer disappointed them. None. Burns had done everything wrong by doctrine standards. He engaged from a static position rather than displacing after his first shot. He exposed himself unnecessarily. He continued firing after missing twice when doctrine said, "Withdraw and reposition." His success validated no tactical principle except the oldest one. Desperate courage sometimes produces impossible results. The Army recognized this in the citation for his Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's 2nd highest valor award. The medal acknowledged his actions while implicitly warning others not to attempt replication. What Burns did worked once, for him, under specific circumstances that would never repeat exactly. It was heroism, not doctrine. Major General Terry Allen, commanding the 104th Infantry Division, personally presented Burns with his medal and field promotion to sergeant. Allen understood that Burns represented something the division needed, proof that German armor was not invincible, that individual soldiers could effect battles that seemed beyond their control, that courage mattered even against overwhelming material superiority. Allen had commanded the 1st Infantry Division in North Africa and Sicily, where he had seen the psychological impact of German armor on American infantry. He knew that morale was as important as tactics. Burns' story, spread throughout the division, provided morale in tangible form. If a farm boy from Illinois could stop 2 tigers alone, then anything was possible. But Burns himself struggled with the aftermath of his action. In interviews conducted decades later, after his military service ended, and he lived in Florida in relative obscurity, Burns described the weight of survival. He remembered the faces of the German tank crews who bailed out of the disabled tiger, young men who looked as terrified as he felt. He remembered the 2nd tiger exploding, knowing that men died in that explosion, men who had families and homes and reasons to live. He remembered other Americans who had not survived similar situations, soldiers whose courage matched his, but whose luck did not. The medal felt like acknowledgement of luck as much as skill, and luck was an uncomfortable thing to be celebrated for. He had done what the situation required, because doing nothing would have meant other men died. That the situation resolved in his favor was beyond his control. He had aimed, fired, and survived. The rockets had flown true. The tanks had stopped. Nothing in his farm upbringing, nothing in his training, had prepared him for carrying the knowledge that he had killed men and been decorated for it. The bazooka Burns used that December morning was recovered after the battle and sent to ordnance for inspection. Engineers wanted to understand whether the weapon had performed normally or whether some anomaly explained Burns' success. They found nothing unusual. The launcher was standard M1A1, manufactured in 1943, showing normal wear. The rockets Burns fired were standard M6A1, within specifications for propellant and warhead. The weapon had worked exactly as designed. The difference was not in the equipment, but in the circumstances. The range, the angle, the specific weak points Burns targeted, and the impossible accuracy he achieved under impossible conditions. Ordnance concluded that the engagement demonstrated the bazooka's potential when used by skilled operators under ideal conditions. This conclusion satisfied the bureaucratic need for explanation while missing the essential truth. Nothing about Lucherberg represented ideal conditions, and Burns' skill was largely irrelevant compared to his luck and his willingness to act when action seemed futile. By January 1945, the 104th Infantry Division had advanced deeper into Germany, fighting through the same bitter winter that brought the Battle of the Bulge to the south. Burns continued serving with his unit, now as a sergeant, carrying the same bazooka he had used at Lucherberg. He never again engaged a Tiger tank. The engagements that followed were smaller, brief firefights against German infantry, the grinding attrition of urban combat, where tanks rarely appeared and bazookas served primarily against fortified positions. Burns survived the war without additional decorations or notable actions. He returned to the United States in late 1945, was discharged, and disappeared into civilian life with millions of other veterans who had done extraordinary things they preferred not to discuss. The 2 Tigers Burns destroyed were identified after the war, through German records. The first Tiger, the one he disabled with a shot to the turret ring, was recovered and examined by American intelligence officers. The examination confirmed that Burns' rocket had penetrated the narrow gap between the gun mantlet and turret face, a target area roughly 8 inches wide. At 50 feet, with iron sights improvised from bent wire, hitting that target required either exceptional skill or exceptional luck. The intelligence report noted that the shot would be difficult to replicate under controlled conditions and nearly impossible under combat conditions. The second Tiger, which had exploded, was too damaged for detailed examination, but German records indicated it was a late production Mark 6 with the standard 88mm gun. Both tanks had been assigned to a Kampfgruppe supporting the defense of the Hürtgen Forest sector. Their loss significantly degraded German defensive capability in that area, contributing to the American advance that continued through December. The broader significance of Burns' action at Lucherberg lay not in its tactical impact, but in what it revealed about infantry anti-tank combat in late 1944. American infantry faced German armor that was qualitatively superior to American tanks. The Sherman, backbone of American armored forces, was outmatched by both Tigers and Panthers in direct combat. American tactical doctrine compensated through numbers, air support, and superior logistics. But at the infantry level, soldiers faced tanks their own armor could not reliably defeat. The bazooka provided an option, however inadequate. It allowed infantry to threaten armor, to force German tanks to operate cautiously, to occasionally achieve kills that disrupted German operations. The weapon's technical limitations mattered less than its psychological impact. German armor that might have advanced aggressively instead proceeded carefully, aware that any building might hide a bazooka team. This caution slowed German operations, created opportunities for American artillery and air power, and allowed infantry to hold positions they might otherwise have abandoned. Burns understood none of this broader context during the battle. He understood only that a Tiger was advancing and he possessed a bazooka. The decision to engage was not strategic. It was immediate, personal, born from the conviction that inaction would result in other men's deaths. This immediate personal calculus defined infantry combat in ways that strategic analysis could not capture. Wars were fought for national objectives, but battles were decided by individual soldiers, making individual choices in moments of crisis. Burns chose to act. The rockets flew true, the Tigers stopped. Everything else was interpretation, meaning assigned after the fact by people who had not been there. Decades after the war, military historians would study Lucherberg as a case study in infantry anti-tank tactics. The analysis was largely useless. Burns had violated every principle of proper bazooka employment. He engaged from a static position. He continued firing after missing. He exposed himself unnecessarily. He targeted the most difficult weak point rather than aiming for easier targets like tracks or engine decks. His success validated no tactical principle, except that desperate courage sometimes produces results that careful tactics cannot. The lesson, if there was one, was that doctrine provided guidelines, not rules, that combat was fundamentally unpredictable, and that the human element, courage, luck, desperation mattered as much as technology or training. The bazooka itself would continue evolving after the war. The M20 Super Bazooka, introduced too late for World War II, but used extensively in Korea, increased the warhead diameter to 3.5 inches, providing significantly improved penetration. Later developments produced the M72 LAW, a disposable single-shot weapon that replaced the bazooka in the 1960s. Each generation improved on the last, addressing the limitations that made the World War II bazooka such a desperate weapon. But no later anti-tank weapon would face the same mismatch that Burns confronted. A 2.36-inch rocket against 4 inches of sloped armour, iron sights against a 60-ton tank, one man alone against Germany's most powerful weapon. The farm that shaped Burns' character no longer exists. The land was sold after his family left Illinois, subdivided, developed. The village of Lucherberg was rebuilt after the war, its shattered buildings replaced, the scars of combat erased. The square where 2 Tigers burned is now a parking area. No memorial marks what happened there on December 6, 1944. The Distinguished Service Cross citation resides in the National Archives, one document among millions recording individual acts during a war that generated acts of courage too numerous to fully document. Burns himself rarely spoke of Lucherberg after the war. Friends in Florida knew he was a veteran, knew he had served in Europe, but few knew the details. He was a quiet man, private about his service, carrying memories he preferred not to share. What happened in Lucherberg mattered because it demonstrated something essential about the nature of infantry combat. Technology mattered, doctrine mattered, training mattered. But in the end, battles were decided by individual soldiers in specific moments, making choices that could not be planned or predicted. Burns had faced a situation that doctrine said was hopeless. He acted anyway. The technical limitations of his weapon, the massive superiority of the enemy tanks, the statistical improbability of success, none of this prevented him from loading a rocket and firing. The outcome was uncertain. The action was necessary. That calculus defined infantry combat at its most fundamental level. The 2 Tigers destroyed at Lucherberg represented a tiny fraction of the thousands of tanks destroyed during World War II. In the vast scale of industrial warfare, 2 tanks were statistically insignificant. Yet for the soldiers of the 104th Infantry Division advancing through Germany in December 1944, those 2 tanks were everything. They were the immediate threat, the enemy in front of them, the obstacle that had to be overcome. George Burns overcame them not because he possessed superior technology or perfect training, but because when the moment required action, he acted. That he survived that action was luck. That he attempted it was courage. The distinction between the two defined the difference between a decoration and a funeral. Burns died in 1994 in Florida, 72 years old, having lived a quiet civilian life notable mainly for what he refused to discuss. The Distinguished Service Cross was buried with him. His family knew he was a hero. His friends suspected it. He himself remained uncertain, carrying to his death the knowledge that he had done something extraordinary under circumstances he would never fully understand. He had been a farm boy who faced something larger than himself and found a way to stop it. The memory of that morning in Lucherberg never left him. The cold, the fear, the impossible accuracy of his third shot, the explosion of the second tiger, and the weight of survival when so many others had not survived. In the end, George Burns' story matters not because it was typical, but because it was extraordinary. Most bazooka engagements against tigers ended in failure. Most infantry who faced armor died or withdrew. Burns succeeded where success should have been impossible, and that success demonstrated something essential about war: that courage and luck together can overcome material disadvantage, that individual action can change outcomes that seem predetermined, and that sometimes, when nothing else remains, a farm boy with a bazooka can stop 60 tons of German armor and change the course of a battle that history would otherwise forget. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.